Chapter 1, You Don't Want to Go Down There, Bunny, Nangma said with a derisive laugh. Bunirti scowled. Call me Bunny again, she snarled, and you might wake up tomorrow with the last drops of your blood spattering onto the floor under your bunk. Nangma laughed again. Sensitive are we? You want to put up a tough front, but you're nothing here. You haven't earned the right to be treated as somebody yet. By the look of you, you never will. But hey, go on down there. You'll walk in. You'll disappear like the others. And me, I'll just be glad to be rid of you so quickly and cleanly. Bunirti stood up and pointedly turned her back on Nangma. I don't need to prove myself to scum like you. The other woman leapt up. In the span of a heartbeat, she had the sharp point of her collector pressed against the small of Bunirti's back. Call me scum again. Do it. Bunirti's voice was flat as she answered. Sit back down unless you want to die right here and right now, and let this be the last time you even think of threatening me. Instead of feeling the collector pull away, Bunirti felt a slight prick as the weapon pierced her uniform and jabbed into her skin. Swiftly and almost silently, Bunirti outmaneuvered Nangma, bringing the other woman down on her back with Bunirti straddling her. Nangma's collector clattered to the tile floor, while Bunirti's own collector jabbed forcefully under Nangma's chin, just shy of drawing blood. Stop, please, Nangma said through her teeth, her jaw moving only minimally. If I was going to kill you, you'd be dead right now, Bunirti said with saccharine exaggeration. And I know I'd get away with it, because I'm not street scum like you, and I can buy whatever lawyers I want. But I don't want the hassle right now, so we'll leave it at this. But don't you ever forget that I spared you once, and I already consider that one time too many. Understood? Yeah, Nangma assented after a moment. Nod your head when you say that, Bunirti said, one corner of her lips turning up in a sneer. Nangma hesitated and then complied. Yeah, she said, giving a slight nod. It was not slight enough. Bunirti's collector punctured her skin, and a thin trickle of blood flowed down along the collector toward the microfunnel. A sample of Nangma's blood was automatically collected, as they both knew would happen, and a large data set describing the events leading up to that moment were immediately sent wirelessly to the nearest info hub. I'm somebody, by the way, Bunirti smirked as she stood up to let Nangma free. And even if I wasn't, I wouldn't hesitate to go down to Sector W84-88D, your so-called wolf block. Childish rumors are not going to scare me off. The only reason the prisoners down there get away with anything is the dereliction of duty by superstitious cretins like you. Nangma quickly stood, pressing the palm of one hand against her chin. She looked like she wanted to say something, but she remained silent and, after retrieving her collector, went to sit on her bunk. The room the two shared was small and Spartan, offering the barest of comforts. Decorations were forbidden, as were excess comfort items. Technically, they were at ease in their room, unlike almost every moment spent out of it, but ease was a relative term. Bunirti knew real ease from her youth, and she looked forward to returning to it later. If she survived, a harsh beep sounded in the room, alerting them to an incoming message. They both stood to face the screen by the door, snapping to attention before the display powered up. The woman on the screen was an animation, her appearance and her computer-rendered surroundings never changing. Violation noted, the animated woman intoned. Section 4C 120R, interpersonal violence between upholders for purposes other than upholding is prohibited. Your balances have each been reduced by the mandatory fine of 500 marks. Nangma Darhai, your balance is now below 0. If you do not correct this before 23:30 today, you will be selected for extra duties to compensate for this discrepancy. The display went dark, and the two women relaxed again. Bitch, Nangma said under her breath. She's just an animation, Bunirti commented with a smirk, knowing the comment was actually addressed at her, and mentally daring Nangma to clarify. Nangma scowled, but at first said nothing. If you can buy whatever lawyers you need, she finally spoke up, why not just buy your way out of this service? I've heard that lots of rich kids do that. Bunirti snorted. Yes, some of my so-called peers took that route, and every last one of them is lazy, weak, stupid, and unprincipled. Some of their parents did the same, and they think they're accepted despite cheating their way out of service. Honorable people like my parents treat them politely when they must, but there is a gulf between the cheaters and the honorable that the cheaters never comprehend, and when the honorable are alone among themselves, they do not speak kindly of the cheaters. So yes, I could have bought my way out of this service, but I am not lazy, I am not weak, I am not stupid, and I am most certainly not unprincipled. Nangma looked away. Most certainly not, she echoed quietly. After a moment, she looked back at Bunardy. I guess street scum like me have much less complicated lives. Undoubtedly, Bunardy agreed with a roll of her eyes. Silence fell between the two women, and Bunardy decided it was a good time to review her study materials. The testing imposed on upholders was designed to lengthen their service as much as possible. But she knew she was smart, and while she would not cheat, she had no intention of serving any more than absolutely necessary to earn her pass out of upholding and into the life of her choosing. Once settled on her bunk, Bunardy slid her infoscroll from its protective case and unfurled it to a comfortable width. A few gestures with her thumbs brought up the material she needed to study for the next exam, and she immediately plunged her thoughts into the words and images on the scroll. At first, she was vaguely aware that Nangma was watching her with obvious animosity, but she had plenty of practice ignoring the hateful stares of those less wealthy. A siren blast moved both women to their feet. They weren't startled, it was too common of an occurrence for that, but neither looked happy as they grabbed their armor. Despite their differences, Bunardy knew that Nangma's thoughts were the same as hers at that moment. Not thoughts really, but a mental ticking of a countdown timer. The repercussions for tardiness were severe and would be doled out equally, regardless of the upholder's background. At the same time, there was a vague curiosity about whether this was a drill or a real event. Most were drills, naturally, but she'd seen action in the relatively short span of her service so far, and she was already racking up her count of kills, or ultimate collections, as they were formally called. When the two women left their quarters, the door snapped shut and sealed itself automatically. The corridor was already full of other upholders, moving in orderly, but rapid streams toward the deployment portals. Bunardy gave little thought to where Nangma would end up, for it was unlikely the two would be deployed to the same area. When it was her turn, she did a snappy about-face and stepped backward into the deployment pod, her limbs and head positioned correctly with drilled precision. The restraints clicked into place long before the glowing countdown timer in the pod reached 0. The strong G-force as the pod was launched brought Bunardy's curiosity to the fore. Either there was some real urgency to the situation, or she was going to be deployed farther away than normal. Either way, it could be a nice break from the routine. Despite her willingness to serve, she had to admit the routine grew dull quickly. When she arrived at her destination, her head-up display would light up and provide whatever information would be needed. But for now, there was nothing to relieve either the darkness inside her pod nor her curiosity. A red glow let Bunardy know that she was getting close. The light grew brighter, and the colors shifted toward daylight at a rate that was optimized to prepare her eyes for the destination lighting. Moments after it reached daylight level, the HUD in her helmet engaged, displaying a variety of things she might want to know. Ignoring the vital signs and similar monitors, she focused on the mission briefing. She barely had time to skim it before a sharp decrease in speed announced her arrival. Terrorist sympathizers, she said to herself after verifying her radio was still on manual mute. Probably some sign-waving scum. Would be more interesting if it was an actual terrorist. With guidance from her HUD, Bunardy moved out from her pod as soon as it opened. It took her less than a minute to arrive at the position that was designated for her. She could tell that she was part of a mesh perimeter, and she guessed from other details that they were protecting a high-ranking politician, probably a senator. The surroundings looked residential, so she assumed they were surrounding the politician's home. Bunardy switched her radio back to automatic and settled into guard stance, using a combination of her own eyesight, warn sensors, and streaming data from area sensors to maximize her situational awareness. Time seemed to drag. Alertness was maintained primarily through training, but vapor delivered through her armor's breathing system ensured a steady, if slight, stream of stimulant to protect against fatigue or lack of self-discipline. The chemical added a faint metallic taste and smell to the filtered air, and Bunardy believed the rumors that it was intentionally unpleasant as another way of keeping upholders alert. About 90 minutes after arrival on the scene, Bunardy received the recall command. She turned promptly and headed back to the pod that would return her to her quarters. Around her, she could see all but one of the upholders doing the same. She slowed as the one stationary upholder caught her attention. She continued moving toward her pod, but she stared in the direction of the unknown upholder. This was clearly not regulation behavior, and that meant it was likely a threat. Non-responding upholder, Bunardy snapped, allowing her radio to enable itself. She wasn't sure if any of the others around her had reported it, since they did not use an open channel. And she also knew that the on-scene supervisor should already be aware of the anomaly, but it was their duty to report it, and she was not about to fail that duty. Confirmed, the response came promptly. Continue recall with heightened awareness. Ultimate collection authorized for self-defense only. Bunardi continued onto her pod, keeping a close eye on the motionless figure. The situation did not change by the time she reached the pod, and she was soon racing back toward her quarters. Curious, but assuming she would never hear more about the problem. There were a few innocuous possibilities, but most likely the upholder was intentionally disobeying. The price for doing so would be so severe that Bunardi assumed it could only be motivated either by politics or a death wish, neither of which she could fully comprehend. As the red glow began on the approach to her quarters, she briefly wondered if someone like Nong Ma, or even Nong Ma herself, would find upholding so difficult that they would choose death over it. There was no guarantee that the upholder who did not recall as ordered would be killed as a result, but it certainly set the stage for a suicidal gesture. Nong Ma was sitting on her bunk when Bunardi entered their room. A mix of reactions washed through her mind, mostly surprise that her roommate was already back and seemed to have been there long enough to relax, but also a vague ambivalence about the non-responding upholder not being Nong Ma, and something else. She dismissed the notion that it was guilt, but couldn't put a word on it about her almost subconscious wish that it had been Nong Ma standing out there. Without a word, she moved over to her locker and began removing her armor and storing it properly for its next use. Nong Ma also said nothing and showed little interest in the post-deployment routine of her roommate. For a short while, Bunardi returned to her reading, but her growing hunger provided enough distraction that she finally set it aside. She was about to leave to get food when she heard a soft chime from her wrist. Mentally grumbling about the seeming deterioration in battery quality, she quickly swapped the battery in her wrist comm and held it next to the comm screen by the door until a short chirp confirmed that it was resynchronized. Without a word to Nong Ma, she then left their quarters and headed briskly toward the dining facility. Considering that the population of the barracks building was almost that of a small town, and given the varied schedules of the upholders' work, the dining function operated at all hours. It was no surprise to Bunardi that there was a line of upholders in the corridor leading into the dining area. She knew, as they all knew, that the food would be precisely measured for optimum nutrition, and its taste would be good enough to make it edible without being so good as to make it desirable in excess. When she returned to her room, Bunardi's stomach was satisfied, but her mind was not. After staring at her reading material for a while without making any progress, she set it aside and suppressed the urge to let out an irritated sigh. She didn't want to show any hint of weakness in front of Nong Ma. Irritation was emotional, and emotions were weak. She knew she couldn't avoid them, but letting them be visible was the sort of nonsense that could wait until she was an old woman. That is, if she didn't follow the norm and opt out of old age. Still, she knew she was restless, and she was annoyed that she could not focus on her studies. Abruptly, she stood up and walked to the comm screen and tapped it to wake it up. Upholder Bunardi, Kitran requesting extra duties. Preference, Sector W84-88D, she stated, keeping her voice calm. It was time to visit Wolf Block and resolve her curiosity. Granted, the reply came almost instantly. Report in 26 minutes to station W84. In her peripheral vision, Bunardi saw Nong Ma look up at her, but she did not acknowledge her roommate's attention. Instead, she moved to change into the lighter-weight interior duty armor that would be necessary for her assignment. She did not need to hurry, nor did she have time to dally. The duty station was a significant distance from her quarters, and she was confident that the mix of walking and automated transports would put her there slightly early if she kept a steady pace. Don't talk to them, Nong Ma spoke up as Bunardi moved toward the door. Annoyed at the interruption, Bunardi glanced over at Nong Ma. Of course, I'm going to talk to them if I need to give them commands, she replied. Keep your silly fear-mongering to yourself. Don't talk with them, Nong Ma corrected herself. Don't engage in conversation. Bunardi sneered openly. Why would I converse with prisoners? But thank you for your concern. She left the room abruptly. Chapter 2, the route to the duty station was not direct, but the automated transports took Bunardi deep underground and minimized the amount of walking that she needed to do. Where there were long, straight stretches to walk, optional moving walkways along one side of the corridor, helped reduce her travel time. The minimal HUD and the interior duty armor provided the guidance she needed to reach her destination. When she arrived, she found two older-looking male upholders seated at the desk behind the shield glass. A glance at their rank insignia confirmed that she was junior to them. When she pressed her hand against the palm reader to enable the intercom, she knew that her prints would be cross-checked with her wristcom to confirm her identity, after which she would be checked in at her duty station, and the upholders on the other side of the glass would have her pertinent information. Upholder Kitran, one of the men, acknowledged her. "Did you lose a bet?" "No, sir," she replied evenly. It was no surprise that volunteering for extra duty, and in Wolf Block specifically, would evoke some non-routine responses. "This your first time to Wolf Block?" the other man asked. "Yes, sir," she confirmed. The two men exchanged a look that Bunierty did not take as a compliment. One of them reached over to his console and pressed a button. She heard the door unlock, and without waiting for further instruction, she proceeded from the outer corridor into the secure area. Even on that side, the booth in which the men sat was walled off with shield glass. Further down the corridor, Bunierty could see a set of doors that she assumed were lifts that provided transport down to the prison sectors. "May I proceed?" she asked. She felt a slight apprehension, which she did not want to label as nervousness, and she hoped her voice held no hint of it. "Proceed," one of the men answered. "Lift 6. You will be relieving Upholder Garker." With a nod, Bunierty walked forward to the lift doors. She waved her wristcom over the control panel for lift 6 and did not have to wait long before the doors slid open. She stepped in briskly, and the doors slid closed behind her. She could feel the quick drop in her stomach, and moments later the doors slid open again. She stepped out and checked her HUD for information, then turned to her right and used her wristcom to identify herself to the door leading to Corridor D. The door unlocked, and she stepped through, almost running into the upholder who stood facing away from the door, looking down the corridor lined with prison cells. He turned abruptly, looking startled, collector in hand. When he saw Bunierty, his face relaxed. "Thank you for what?" Bunierty asked. "You are here to relieve me, right?" the upholder asked in return. "Well, yes," she confirmed. "I'm happy to get out of here," the other upholder said. "You'll see, when your relief comes you will be thanking them too." Bunierty did not know what to say in response, so she changed the topic. "I am assuming their schedule will be delivered via HUD. Is there anything else I should know?" The upholder laughed. "This is Wolf Block," he blurted. "If this is your first time here, there is not much I can tell you. Well, maybe just good luck." With no further conversation, the other upholder waved his wristcom over the reader by the door to let himself out. Bunierty rolled her eyes as he left, and then looked back down the corridor, and the prison cells that lined it on both sides all the way to the far end that ended with a blank wall. She noticed that it was quieter than any other prison block she had served in. She noted, too, that despite the ample lighting and the ability to see through the shield glass and bars that formed the wall between each cell and the corridor, she could not see any of the prisoners from where she stood. She decided to take a stroll down the center of the corridor to make her presence known, and to verify that all prisoners were in place. Considering the behavior of the upholder she relieved, she could not trust that all was in order. As she began to move down the hall, the first of the strange rumors from Wolf Block was confirmed. The prisoners were not just being quiet. She found that they were all standing at the back of their cells, facing the back wall, so she could not see their faces. Strange prisoner behavior was one thing, but Bunierty was not about to believe the rumors about strange disappearances of upholders. Prisoners disappearing and then returning, upholders being violently murdered in the middle of the corridor with no evidence that prisoners were involved, and similar rumors. When she reached the end of the hall, she turned and began to walk back toward the door. This time, as she walked along the hall, she saw that all of the prisoners had turned around and were slowly approaching the wall that separated their cell from the corridor. "Mind games," Bunierty said quietly to herself. "I suppose weak-minded people could be unnerved by them." She turned around when she reached the door, and now she could see that all of the prisoners had reached the bars and shield glass. They stood with perfect posture, hands at their sides, and remained silent. Bunierty smirked as she realized that they were making it easy for her to keep an eye on them this way. She settled into a comfortable stance and waited to see if her HUD would announce something for the prisoner's schedule, such as delivery of a meal. She tried to not watch the clock display in one corner of her HUD, but it was not easy and time began to drag again. When she got restless enough, she decided to pace the hallway again. "Question your assumptions," the first prisoner on her right whispered to her as she walked by. Despite not wanting to react, Bunardi was surprised enough that she glanced over at the prisoner. He didn't look much older than her, although the standard prisoner uniform tended to mask age. His expression was flat as she moved on down the hall. "Question authority," another prisoner whispered on her left. This time, Bunardi resisted the inclination to look at him. "Some illusions are harmless," whispered the next prisoner on her right. "Some illusions are deadly," whispered the next prisoner on her left. "The pawn never sees the whole game. Sheep do not comprehend the upcoming slaughter." They each had something to whisper as she made her way down the corridor. By the time she reached the far end, she was gritting her teeth to avoid responding. She turned abruptly at the end to begin her walk back. She kept her speed as consistent as possible to avoid showing any response to their voices. When she reached the midpoint of the corridor, they fell silent. A few steps later, they burst out laughing in unison. The sudden loud noise after the silence startling Bunardi, despite her attempt to steel herself against whatever they might do next. She wanted to scream at them to be silent, but she stopped herself, knowing that she needed to maintain her own discipline. When she reached the door and turned again, they fell silent in unison. The unpleasant experience of her second walk down the corridor effectively held at bay any sense of being restless. Bunardi stood in an alert rest stance and watched the prisoners, who were now turned so that the nearest ones were looking directly at her. She didn't understand how they could coordinate their efforts, or how they could develop a way to coordinate their efforts while under the observation of guards. But she admitted to herself that they were effectively making her uncomfortable. Still, there was a wide gulf between mind games and the physical aspects of the other roomers, and she intended to keep that difference firmly in mind. As she stood there, watching them watch her, she wondered how the situation in this prison block could have been allowed to develop as it had. There seemed to be a significant dereliction of duty, and Bunardi wondered if it was something she could root out, and whether doing so would advance her in upholding or at least shorten her service time. With the block once more silent and motionless, Bunardi had plenty of time to think. She regretfully acknowledged that this also gave her plenty of time to question whether she was taking the right approach by not responding to the prisoners, and to wonder whether this was actually what they wanted. Perhaps they wanted her to retreat into her own thoughts to avoid seeing what they were doing, and maybe they wanted to intimidate her from walking along the corridor to check on them. As she pondered her inability to see the prisoners at the far end, she became increasingly convinced that this was the case, and she prepared herself for another trip to the far end and back. "Order, order, order." The prisoner on her right began to chant as she began her walk. "Chaos, chaos, chaos," the prisoner on her left chanted. As Bunardi paced down the hall, the prisoners on the right maintained the order chant, and the prisoners on the left continued to chant chaos. When she turned at the far end and headed back toward the door, the prisoners switched their cha. NTS so that again, there was order on the right and chaos on the left. This time she smiled, knowing they couldn't see it behind her face mask. It seemed so nonsensical to her that it struck her as comical. When she reached the door and turned again, the prisoners fell silent, and she was left with a sense of relief that it had not been as disturbing as before. She stood by the door a while, this time not dreading her next walk, and was about to set out again when her HUD alerted her to the arrival of the prisoners' meals. "Meal time," she barked, her first words to the prisoners sounding odd to her own ears after her long silence. The prisoners didn't react to her announcement, unlike prisoners in other blocks she had guarded. After her relatively short time in Wolf Block, though, their lack of reaction did not surprise her. She stepped to one side of the corridor and waved her wristcom by the door reader. The door opened, and an electric truck robot rolled in, pulling in a train of auto carts. Once it was fully within the block, Bunardi closed the door behind it. The robot rolled forward, and as it made its way down the corridor, the rearmost auto carts detached themselves from the train and used basic optic guidance to route themselves to the delivery interface built into each cell. When the truck reached the end, it paused for its programmed delay before rolling back toward Bunardi. As it passed the now empty auto carts, they attached themselves to the rear of the growing train. When the equipment reached the door, Bunardi opened it again, waited for the last auto cart to roll by, and then closed the door. When she looked back at the prisoners, she saw that they were all standing motionless by the shield glass, each facing the prisoner directly across the hall. They showed no interest in the food, that the auto carts delivered to their cells. Other than knowing she couldn't expect normal prisoner behavior, she didn't know what else to expect regarding their mealtime. It was up to them, she reasoned, to eat or not eat. It was not her responsibility to ensure they didn't starve. On the other hand, she knew it was time for another walk, and she knew this would take her down the middle of their mutual stairs. Grimacing, she stepped away from the door. "I'm hungry." The prisoner on her right spoke up in a disturbing impression of a whining child. Bunyardi walked on, biting back the response that wanted to burst past her lips. "I'm hungry," each prisoner announced as she passed, each sounding childlike. This time Bunyardi did not feel amused. It just seemed irritating, and clearly intended to be so. There was no mystery or oddity, it was just obnoxious. When she reached the end of the hall, she turned abruptly and stalked back, wondering what asinine thing would come from them next. Silence, however, was the prisoner's choice this time. She reached the door and turned to face them. And as she did, they all sat down in unison, opened their food containers, and began to take synchronized mouthfuls. Once again, their ability to coordinate their actions troubled her, and she realized that it was not just strange. It actually posed a real risk if they could act together toward a goal. Bunyardi knew that recognizing the danger was the first step to mitigating it, and she put some thought into how she might avoid letting their coordination give them the upper hand. "I want to know how it works," she finally said to herself, as if it was an excuse for what she was about to do. She stepped away from the door, but instead of heading to the other end of the hall, she walked directly to the first cell on the left, across the corridor from the prisoner she had looked at directly before. The man in the cell was clearly older, with ample silver hair mixed in with his dark brown. He did not break from his coordinated eating routine, and Bunyardi paced back and forth in front of his cell to see if blocking his vision would make a difference. This seemed to have no effect. She was certain there had not been any audio signals given, and she began to wonder if it was a timed and rehearsed routine, using external events such as a guard change or meal arrival as the synchronizing guide. It seemed to be a reasonable explanation, but it did not explain how they could have developed it in the first place. "My wife and daughter were murdered while I was forced to watch," the man in front of her said, startling Bunyardi out of her thoughts. She glanced around and saw that the other prisoners were sitting still, facing directly out into the hall. She looked back at the man in his cell and noted that he had finished his meal, and the dissolution compounds in the packaging were already breaking down the food remnants and packaging. The meaning of his words, finally, made it past her surprise at having been lost in thought. "I'm sorry," she offered her belated reply, knowing she didn't sound sincere, but also not knowing what to say. She wasn't even sure it was true, and if it was, she didn't see how it was relevant. Was he just bored or lonely, and wanting to share what was on his mind? Or was there some meaning she was missing? "She's sorry," the prisoner behind Bunyardi said. "She's sorry," the prisoner adjacent to the man she faced repeated. "She's sorry." The phrase was repeated all the way down the hall. Annoyed, Bunyardi returned to her position at the door. As silence returned to the prison block, with the prisoners once again sitting motionless on the floor, staring directly across the corridor, Bunyardi admitted to herself that the upholder she relieved was right. She would be thankful when her relief arrived. Since she volunteered for duty, however, she had no idea how long she would be stationed there. The faint urges of her own bodily functions made her wonder. Did the prisoners empty their bladders in unison? Did they synchronize the evacuation of their bowels? The thought was both amusing and irritating to her. When another upholder finally arrived, several hours and many walks of the corridor later, Bunyardi was eager to be gone from Wolf Block. She did not outwardly show it, however, and refrained from repeating the unprofessional behavior of upholder Garker. Duty was duty. Sometimes it was unpleasant, usually it was just boring. There was no need to verbally thank another upholder for doing their duty. Bunyardi made her way back to the station W84 desk by way of a secured restroom. When she reached the booth, she saw two different upholders, and she felt some slight disappointment at not being able to demonstrate to the two men stationed there earlier that she had successfully served her first duty in Wolf Block with no ill effects. Even so, she would be proving Nangma wrong about being one of those who supposedly never returned at all. Chapter 3, Go Ahead, Bunyardi said to her roommate when she returned to her quarters. Nangma shrugged. "Yeah," she acknowledged. "You made it back. My loss. Shouldn't you be doing something to get some marks, to get your account above 0? Bunyardi prodded as she started stowing her armor. "There are probably some men who would pay for something." "At least I could get paid, if that was something I wanted to do," Nangma remarked without insulting Bunardi directly. But I'll take extra duty, instead of worrying about my marks balance. Won't be the first time, won't be the last. It was Bunardi's turn to shrug off her roommate's comment. Before she entered upholding, she'd had enough men, of all ages, try to bed her that she knew she wasn't lacking in appeal. Money mismanagement, the core of poverty, she remarked. Nangma gave a short laugh. If you say so, but we're not really supposed to speak poorly of our government. Bunardi turned to Nangma, glaring. Don't you dare blame the government for your station in life, and don't you dare even hint that I would speak poorly of the government. Nangma yawned. Well, remember that street scum like me have pretty simple lives. We don't get agitated for or against the government. We're just looking for decent eats, a clean bed, and to stay out of the weather. Still glaring, Bunardi turned away from Nangma and held her tongue. Despite the many things that came to mind, she saw no point in saying anything more to the other young woman. She finished putting away her armor, and then settled once more onto her bunk to do some studying. Nothing more was said between them for the rest of the day. Bunardi was silently glad when the lights-out warning chime sounded. She was ready for the day to be over. As she settled in to sleep, she thought about the many other upholders who were just now waking to begin their shifts. And she gave some idle thought to those who would end up pulling wolf block as part of their daily duties. When the lights turned on, marking the new day for the two women, they both arose quickly and prepared for the day. They left together to get breakfast, but said nothing to each other and kept apart once they were away from their room. Bunardi knew that many upholders tried to build friendships within upholding, which she acknowledged made sense for those who would be in it for the long term. She had no interest in making attachments with other upholders, however. Her service would be valuable but short. As she ate her food at a large rectangular table, fragments of the conversations among the upholders around drifted through her thoughts. For the most part, she was focused on a test scheduled for her later that day. It wasn't an advancement test, but it could serve as a precursor to one, essentially opening the door to it if she passed this one with a high enough score. Sometimes the tests seemed irrationally difficult and thus intended to keep upholders in place, but she hoped this was not one of them. Before she could finish her breakfast, Bunardi was signaled on her wristcom that she was assigned guard duty for which she needed to report in 1 hour. When she saw the duty station in the alert, her heart sank. W84-88D. It was bad enough that she would be kept from studying and might even miss the test, but to be assigned to Wolf Block again so soon rankled her. She said nothing, of course, and marshaled her thoughts. Duty is duty, and sometimes it was unpleasant. She gulped down the last of her food and washed it down with the dregs of her coffee before taking her tray to the cleaning station. She then hastened back to her quarters so that she would not be late reporting to station W84. When Bunardi reached the station, she saw that one of the two upholders in the booth was one of the men who checked her in the day before. He made no comment and showed no sign that he recognized her, and she was soon dropping down to level 88. This time she didn't need any information from her HUD to find the correct door. She let herself in and was surprised to see an upholder sitting on the floor by the door. Before she could say anything, the other upholder jumped up and ran out. Shaking her head, Bunardi closed the door. Ridiculous, she said to herself. She immediately regretted saying it as loud as she did. For the prisoners, standing at the bar-reinforced shield glass walls of their cells, repeated her pronouncement in sequence down to the other end of the hall. Bunardi remembered her thoughts the prior day about the prisoners possibly using external events as synchronization guides, and she wondered if she had just witnessed this in action. She also wondered if there was a way to throw them off, to disrupt their synchronization and weaken their apparent unity. As she began her first walk through the hall, she considered how she might disrupt the meal delivery and possibly disrupt their routine. "I like you," the first prisoner on her right stated as she began her walk. "We like you," the prisoner on her left then spoke up. "We all like you," the next prisoner on her right said. Bunardi stopped. She realized that she was following a predictable pattern. She immediately did an about-face and returned to her position at the door. Bunardi realized it was going to be a challenge to disrupt their synchrony if they were using the conformity of guard behavior to regulate their own actions. It would be necessary to find a balance between doing her duty and minimizing predictability, all the while not knowing whether it was even relevant and worth the effort. "We like you," the prisoners said in unison. She stopped herself from shaking her head in annoyance. She knew she might not be able to avoid it completely, but she wanted to minimize the reactions they could elicit from her. "We like you," Upholder Kitran, the prisoners of Wolf Block announced together. It was too much for her. How do you know my name? Bunardi demanded, instantly regretting it. We know many things, they answered in unison. She remained silent, trying to process what just happened. It didn't make sense. They should not have been able to learn her name. And by saying they liked her, were they implying that they were somehow responsible for having her return so soon? She couldn't make sense of it. Finally, she spoke up again. How do you know many things? That's a secret, they answered, perfectly synchronized. Do you always coordinate everything you say and do? Bunardi asked, giving voice to her annoyance. That's a secret, the answer came. So you can't talk separate from the others, whether in unison or in a pattern? I told you part of my history. A solitary voice came from her left. Bunardi quickly thought through her recent questions and realized that most of them were predictably answerable. But the negative phrasing of her most recent question may have thrown them off. She wanted to find other ways to do that, but she knew they might just fall silent if they were backed into a corner. So that wasn't part of a pattern, she asked. You can believe that if it makes you happy, the prisoner on her left answered. She shook her head in frustration, not heeding her own intent to minimize her reactions. It was too late for that. Why do you say you like me? You said you were sorry about Jarrett's family, the prisoners answered together. How did you know whether I meant it or not? We assume you didn't. Then why like me for that? That's a secret. Bunardi let out an exasperated sigh. You're maddening. She heard scattered laughter, and the fact that they weren't laughing together answered her earlier question. Okay, so you don't do everything in unison, so that's no longer a secret, she said, grinning slightly without realizing it. Did you have something to do with me being assigned here again today? That's a secret. Of course, she acknowledged, but let's just say I don't believe any of it. You heard my name from the upholder who relieved me yesterday, and you recognized me today. It was just a coincidence, and you're using it to try to confuse me. You don't actually like me, you're just trying to keep me off balance. There was a slight pause, but not so slight that Bunardi didn't catch it. You can believe that if it makes you happy, the prisoners said in unison. Her grin, still unnoticed, faded abruptly. She felt a sinking sensation as she realized what that slight pause probably meant. If their response had been based entirely on predictability, they wouldn't have paused. This implied that they were synchronizing in real time, and the pause was for a cue. Bunardi realized this could mean there was a lot more danger than she first perceived, for it would require that they had some mechanism for accomplishing it. If they had that, what else might they have? A mixture of fear and anger took hold in her mind. I don't know what you think you're doing, she snapped, but you're not going to get away with it. Sure, maybe little actions here and there, but whatever your grand scheme is, you will fail. I promise you that. The prison block fell silent. In unison, the prisoners turned away from the shield glass and retreated into their cells. Bunardi decided she needed to assert her authority over the situation, so she marched to the far end and back. She saw that the prisoners were now standing at the back of their cells, facing the back wall, as they had been on her first walk along the corridor. Once she returned to the door, she resumed her guard stance, watching and listening. For a long while, there was no sound or motion. Bunardi made another circuit along the corridor, and still the prisoners were facing the rear walls of their cells. She stopped at a couple cells to watch the prisoners within, to see if there was something going on at the far side of the cell that would be a clue to the puzzle. But she saw nothing that implied any communication among the prisoners. The only new thing she noticed was that all of the prisoners had the outline of a wolf's head in profile as a tattoo near their right temple. Back at the door, Bunardi considered the possible implications of the wolf head markings. It was not illegal to get a tattoo. She had seen several on Nongma, but it was certainly not something that was acceptable in polite society. What was more disturbing to her was that they all had the same tattoo, and one seemingly related to where they were imprisoned. In a lower security, holding facility where prisoners were not separated from each other, this would not have been surprising. But the prisoners of Wolf Block should never have been able to give each other such a mark, nor would they ever have had access to someone else who could coordinate their inkings. They could have received their tattoos before being placed in Wolf Block, but even that seemed highly unlikely, especially for the tattoos to all look identical despite being done at separate places and times. The prisoners reappeared at the shield glass walls of their cells. We still like you, Bunardi, they said in unison. Her jaw dropped. They knew her full name. Recovering from the surprise, she scowled deeply. Be silent, you don't want to talk, they asked together. No, you don't want answers. She hesitated. No, did you know Alhan Sriara? No, She was the upholder you saw yesterday who did not recall as ordered, they explained. Again, she felt a pang from realizing how much they knew. Oh, she responded simply. We liked her too. Oh, there was a more noticeable pause. She's dead now. Oh. Bunardi didn't appreciate hearing about an upholder dying, but it was obviously an intentional act on the other woman's part, so she couldn't justify feeling remorse either. You shouldn't fear us, Bunardi snorted. I try not to feel fear at all. Another pause. We feel fear all the time. She shrugged. You're in prison. You're safe if not free. I don't know what you would fear, other than being forgotten down here. Do you like your government? They asked together. Of course I like our government, she answered, emphasizing our, to clarify that she did not exclude them from being under its rule. They murdered my wife and daughter while forcing me to watch, the prisoner named Jirit said. Bunardi shook her head. I don't believe you. Of course you don't believe that yet, they answered in unison. I'm not going to believe it later, she asserted hotly. The prison block fell silent. The prisoners stood still, facing across the corridor at each other. After a while, Bunardi completed another walk along the hall, but the prisoners said nothing and did not move. Back at the door, she looked at the clock in her HUD and willed it to go faster. She wanted to get away, and she was eager to report her findings to her supervisor. Bunardi was sure that the prisoners of Wolf Block needed to be split up from each other to disrupt whatever they were doing. A meal arrived, and Bunardi completed the routine normally, seeing no need to disrupt it now. The prisoners sat in unison, ate in unison, and then stood again in unison. Bunardi expected them to say something or do something more, but they remained motionless and silent. Again, she paced to the far end of the hall and back to the door, but nothing else moved. The silence seemed to press in on her. Bunardi mentally scolded herself for thinking that the HUD clock display was slowing down. She felt increasingly weary, and at one point she was tempted to sit down. The memory of finding the other upholder sitting on the floor gave her a jolt that kept her alert for a bit longer. But it was not long before she again felt regret that the interior duty upholder armor did not include a stimulant supply. Fine, she eventually said, irritation strong in her voice. I want answers, so if you want to share your secrets, go ahead. The prisoners did not react. Okay, I'm sorry about upholder Sriara, although it looked to me like she did it to herself. Now what did you want to tell me? Still the prisoners did not react. Look, I'm not going to acknowledge that the government murdered Jirit's family, at least not without cause. Maybe they did face ultimate collection, I don't know, but I'm not going to call it murder. The silence continued. What happens when something is broken, out of order? The prisoner across from Jirit finally spoke up. We fix it, Bunardi snapped, but if you're saying the government is broken, you're not going to convince me based on some claim from a prisoner about his family being murdered. What happens when somebody is sick? Jirit asked. We heal them, she answered. What is the point of this? How do we heal them? Jirit asked. Bunardi shook her head. I don't know, I'm not a doctor. It depends on what they're sick with. Cancer, for example, the prisoner across from Jirit prompted. We heal the cancer, obviously, she replied. I don't know the details. They get cured, then they're sent off to a climate where they can recover better. And maybe they have to stay there if the treatment left them too weak to return home. Do you ever see them again? Bunardi started pacing next to the door. Of course. Even if they don't come home, we vid chat with them. Really, what is the point of this? Wouldn't it be easier to euthanize them? Jirit asked. She stopped and looked at him. You're angry at the government for supposedly murdering your family, and now you're suggesting that we euthanize sick people. Sure, it would be easier, but that doesn't make it the right thing to do. Once again speaking in unison, the prisoners asked, does the government represent chaos or order? Order, Bunardi snapped. I thought you wanted to give me answers. All you're doing is asking me questions. Sometimes questions are answers. The prisoners responded in unison. Bunardi was at a loss for words. As she stood still by the door, the prison block fell into silence once again. Now, instead of feeling weary, Bunardi felt agitated. Her thoughts raced, trying to piece together the meaning of their riddles. After a short while, she saw the prisoners turn slightly away from her to face directly across the corridor. It almost felt like rejection, but Bunardi instantly scolded herself for being so weak as to even entertain that thought. Time began to drag again. She felt as if a weight had been lifted from her when another upholder finally arrived to relieve her. She left the prison block without a word and returned promptly to her quarters. Chapter 4, her second assignment to Wolf Block, ended early enough that Bunardi was able to attend the test she had scheduled later that day. although she had no time for a last-minute review of the topic. Upholder tests varied widely, some being physical, others behavioral, and others academic. This particular test delved into historical trivia about the origins of upholding. As she worked through it, sitting in a test cubicle under the unceasing gaze of cameras covering multiple angles, Bunerdy's thoughts kept wandering back to the prisoners of Wolfblock. She knew it was hurting her test performance, but the mental discipline she normally enjoyed during tests evaded her. When she reached the end, the low score displayed by the testing interface was no surprise, but it heightened her anger. Upholder Kitran, reporting as ordered, sir, she said that evening after entering the office of her supervisor. She stood at attention in front of his desk, her disciplined gaze directed over his head. You requested this meeting, Upholder Kitran. Be efficient about it, the man said as he remained seated. He appeared to be at least 20 years older than Bunerdy. His gaunt face seemed stretched over his skull, and a long, dark scar marred it below his left eye. Sir, I believe I have important information about the prisoners in Sector W84-88D. She began. The man behind the desk held up his hand to stop her. Do not waste my time with rumors about Wolfblock, Upholder Kitran. Bunerdy kept her expression neutral. This is not about rumors, sir. In my assignments to Sector W84-88D, I observed things that I believe need to be reported. She replied. Keep it to facts you observed and be brief, he said, frowning. Yes, sir, she acknowledged. She then related her observations succinctly, avoiding any obvious speculation, but trying to work in some subjective analysis where she felt it was necessary. Despite wanting to boldly state that the prisoners needed to be separated, Bunerdy knew her supervisor would not be receptive to that suggestion from her. When she was done, he stared at her for a moment and then gave a minimal nod. Noted. Dismissed. He pointedly shifted his attention to something on his desk. Bunerdy did a sharp about-face and departed her supervisor's office promptly. She had not expected much, but the encounter was even more disappointing than she anticipated. When she reached her quarters, Bunerdy was glad to see that her roommate was absent. She briefly wondered why Nangma was away when it was so close to their lights-out time, but she shrugged it off with a guess that her roommate was doing extra duty to resolve her negative mark balance. Bunerdy went to bed early, but sleep did not come until long after the lights went out. 6 days passed for Bunerdy, with no mention of Sector W84-88D. Nangma said nothing to her about it. She was not required to return there for duty, and she received no response about the information she reported to her supervisor. Her days were routine, with alerts and trivial duties interspersed with quiet time in her quarters. Bunerdy tried to convince herself that she was putting her unsettling experiences in Wolfblock behind her, but it wasn't as true as she wanted. On the 7th day, when her third assignment to Sector W84-88D came up on her wristcom, the powerful wave of apprehension that swept over Bunerdy made her heart quicken and her legs feel weak. After relieving the other upholder on duty in the prison block, the first thing Bunerdy did was stride rapidly to the far end of the corridor and back, looking back and forth among the cells, staring into the face of each prisoner as she passed by. They stood at attention, just on the other side of the bars and shield glass, watching her pass without moving their heads. They remained as silent as Bunerdy. Upon reaching the door again, she turned to face down the corridor. Bunerdy watched them move, in unison, to angle themselves toward her. She expected them to say or do something, but nothing more happened. Well, here I am again, Bunerdy said when the silence started to feel too oppressive. She meant it as a comment to herself, but it came out loud enough for the prisoners to hear. She regretted it, but they did not respond, verbally or physically, and she found that their lack of response was both a relief and a new thing to question. The many thoughts from her prior assignments to guard this strange prison block, the questions which she had tried to push away from her mind in recent days, came back with complete clarity. It put her on edge. Without thinking about what she was doing, Bunerdy began to pace back and forth by the door. We still like you, Bunerdy Kitran, the prisoners suddenly said in unison. She stopped pacing and looked from one prisoner to the next. Thanks, I really needed to hear that, she responded, her voice oozing sarcasm. Do you know what a paradigm shift is, Bunerdy? They asked together. Of course, I'm not stupid, she answered, her blatant anger demonstrating that she had completely given up trying to withhold her reactions to them. And you are to call me Upholder Kitran. Do not use my first name. Does the government represent chaos or order, Upholder Kitran? they asked. Bunardi shook her head sharply. No, we've gone down that road before. I'm not doing this again. Question your assumptions, upholder Kitran, they responded. She barked a humorless laugh. You want me to question my own sanity, not my assumptions. We still like you, upholder Kitran, the prisoners said again. So you say, she replied, although this time her voice was softer and more thoughtful than before. After a brief moment of silence, they asked in unison, Are you ready for your personal paradigm shift, upholder Kitran? Bunardi stood very still and silent. She remembered a childhood game where she was blindfolded and spun about. Once dizzy and unable to see, she was then expected to accomplish a task that required both vision and coordination. Except now, instead of being comfortably at home with friends in her parents' mansion, she felt like she was standing on a cliff and being told that she must take a step. Just one step, but an all-important one. Standing still wasn't an option, but she was completely out of balance and could not see where to go. Are you ready, Bunardi? They asked again. Fine, yes, I'm ready. Bunardi finally replied, biting back her reaction to their use of her first name. There was a short interval of silence, followed by a hissing sound. Bunardi stared. The bars and shield glass were gone. The wall at the distant end of the corridor was gone, and just past where it had been she saw doors to a lift. The prisoners stepped forward out of their cells and beckoned to her. Come this way, some said. Welcome, Bunardi, others said. There was no synchronization now, nor rigid postures. On Jirrit, she saw the wolf tattoo was replaced by a small box held on with a thin, light-colored strap that went around his neck. A tiny antenna protruded from the top of the box. He saw her staring at him, and he smiled in return. You remind me of my daughter, he told her. She had cancer. If you'd like to talk with her someday, there's a very good video simulation of her. You'd never know it wasn't her if you hadn't watched her die. Bunardi gaped at him. He shook his head as the doors of the lift opened. Don't worry, just come along quickly. We don't have much time. There is much for you to learn.